So let's take a potentially contentious issue. So let's say, for instance, at any rate, you have a bunch of legal systems which adhere, and I don't mean for a moment to suppose that this would be true for all legal systems, but let's just suppose for a moment you've got a bunch of legal systems which disagree about various other things, but which operate with a broadly Lockean conception of property rules, okay? Now, those Lockean property rules certainly underdetermine abandonment standards, okay? Those abandonment standards might be ones that would say you can start homesteading property, treating it as abandoned, if neither the owner nor some representative of the owner is there within a 2-year period, or the period might instead be 17 years, okay? So I have no burden to argue here about the question, what's the right period? Surely there isn't one single right answer, but what is clear is that the more people interact with each other, the more value there's going to be in standardizing those rules regarding abandonment. That way, there's not going to be a conflict that an organization has to resolve with another dispute resolution organization. Rather, instead, that organization can count on it being the case that the other organization employs much the same abandonment standard. Now, that's a simple example, and obviously there might be other cases where things are more complicated. But I think there's going to be economic pressure on organizations to move toward some level of standardization. Now, you're never going to get uniform acceptance of a libertarian code. I just don't think that's remotely likely. But you are going to get convergent movement toward overlapping commitments. You know, the Catholics and the Jews aren't going to see everything the same way. Neither of them will see everything the same way as the militant secularists. But there's still going to be a lot of pressure for standardization. So it's going to be the case then that if I opt to be a member of Jim Bob's dispute resolution service and therefore contract that Jim Bob's dispute resolution service will resolve conflicts that I have, and I understand that Jim Bob's service will use conflict resolution mechanisms that employ its particular set of rules, I'm consenting, at least during the time I'm a customer of Jim Bob's service, to the use of the rules that Jim Bob's service employs. I understand I can opt out, I can terminate my contract, but there are going to be rules, obviously, that govern what happens if I'm in the middle of a dispute. I can't just opt out there with no consequences, clearly. And so that's going to be covered by contract. Organizations are going to deal with that. But in any event, my relationship with Jim Bob's service will be governed by my consent, my contractual consent directly, either to specific rules, which might happen in some cases, or in other cases, to Jim Bob's use of procedures to identify the applicable rules. So in either case, there's genuine, authentic consent on my part. But there's also going to be consent to the resolution of disputes that might in one way or another not involve the substantive rules Jim Bob's service ordinarily applies, because Jim Bob's service is going to have contractual relationships with other dispute resolution services, other legal regimes, and I'm going to understand that choice of law, conflict of law rules are, meta rules that Jim Bob's service employs that I still have to take account of, and I'm consenting to those as well. So in all of these cases, there can be a genuinely consensual mechanism for determining applicable rules. And clearly, it's going to be to my advantage most of the time, even if I'm not a morally responsible person, which obviously I hope I am, to take account properly of the rules that I've consented to. These are my free commitments here. And similarly, to take account of the need, therefore, to resolve conflicts peacefully. And so most of the time, I'm going to want to be part of an orderly dispute resolution process. I'm not going to want to be an outlaw. And for those people who don't want to be outlaws, and clearly we all have good reason to be, we want to enjoy the protection of dispute resolution services, we want to enjoy the orderly background to social interaction that they provide, we're going to be consenting participants in the legal system. Now, there are two issues, however, that complicate the story I've just told, right? So the story starts out as a fairly simple one. overlapping legal regimes, some of them geographic, some of them ideological or cultural. We participate in them voluntarily, and at the same time, they tend to converge on standards, and they try to avoid conflicts. Pretty straightforward story. However, there are, I think, two complications that do require a little more attention, and I want to talk about those before opening up the floor for questions. So the first of those is that the whole notion of consent may seem problematic, right? If I'm going to consent to the legal regime, then what that means is I have to choose freely, right? If I'm choosing at gunpoint, that would just take the most extreme example. If I'm choosing at gunpoint, I'm not choosing freely. Everybody agrees choices made at gunpoint are non-voluntary. Nobody should be expected to choose between putting his or her name on the contract and seeing his or her brains on the table. An offer you can't refuse isn't a real offer, okay? So far, so good. But what that means is that the very notion of free consent presupposes a background set of rights. And I've just observed that you can't expect a range of legal systems in a stateless society to incorporate the same set of rights guarantees, okay? So it might well be the case then that, to go back to the issue of abandonment, since I think that's certainly one issue that market-oriented anarchists have talked a lot about in recent times, we can clearly imagine that there are some folks for whom abandonment means pretty straightforwardly the absence of the owner or the owner's representative from a piece of property, and those are Lockeans. But we can also imagine mutualists who would say, no, abandonment happens when the owner in person is absent, and if the owner in person is absent, then that property is ripe for homesteading there. Now, there's no getting around the fact that there are potential conflicts here, and that therefore the definition of free consent, which obviously presupposes non-interference with people's justly acquired possessions, is complicated by the fact that we could reasonably expect there to be some disagreement about the rights, the endowments that people arrive at their conflicts with. And so in the case of a Lockean community, it's going to be obvious that I don't give free consent if there is some threat to not only my body, but to my Lockean property rights. Similarly, in a mutualist legal order, we can be sure that people will regard threats to mutualist property rights as, in one way or another, threats to their freedom. So in one case, it's going to be a matter of who gets to homestead or versus who gets to exclude. Okay, so the point here then is that there's got to be some definition of rights that is prior to legal standards, because we can't talk about legal standards as just and at the same time ignore the issue of moral rights, ultimately, of rights to bodies and to justly acquired possessions, which predate, logically precede those legal rights. So it's nice to say that we can imagine a legal system which includes lots of different right claims. But if we're going to say that the legal system is genuinely consensual, we also at the same time have to say that the legal system is only going to count as genuinely consensual if it respects certain pre-existing rights. Okay, so there's no way to guarantee that those pre-existing rights will be respected. So I might well have my own fairly complicated account of what counts as a justly acquired possession or a right to protect my body or somebody else's. But I have to understand that indeed it's going to be the case that there will be legal regimes that aren't going to respect that. Those legal regimes may well be deliberately consensual by their own lines, right? That is, they're not imposing on people without the people's consent,